So this is session 9, the need for secure infrastructure, innovation, and climate action. We're going to have Lisa and Jet from TRCA come up and talk to us about a stakeholder inclusive approach and how that might help us meet the challenges of urban infrastructure planning. And they're going to be using the Ashbridges Bay Landform project as a case study. So Lisa and Jet, come on up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for holding in on another long information-packed day. I'm going to start out this presentation, and then my colleague Jet Taylor is going to join me a little bit later. But this is a little bit different. What we're going to talk to you today, we're a little bit different than the rest of the presentations, and maybe what this will do for you, for those of you that have come maybe from different areas of the province or out of province, it'll provide you with some context of what we're dealing with in Toronto in a highly urbanized area from an environmental assessment perspective and the considerations that we have to integrate in terms of having this really dense infrastructure heavy landscape to work on. I am going to take a second just to give you some context about Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and now that I've said our full name once, I'm going to refer to us as TRCA because I know we all love acronyms in this room. But Beth did a presentation yesterday on our permitting system, our software, and new system coming into place. And when I've talked to people over the last 2 days that aren't aware of conservation authorities or perhaps what TRCA is involved in, is we do really have two different sides to the organization when we think about impact assessment. We've got the regulatory role that we play in the floodplain, and then we have what Jet and I are more involved in is actually project delivery through environmental assessment planning. So we undertake environmental assessments for large waterfront projects through the individual environmental assessment program. Those are multidisciplinary projects that usually have public realm components to them. They'll have infrastructure upgrades and naturalization components to them. We also work really closely with municipal partners on municipal Class EAs, most cases multi-use trail projects where we're supporting our regional trail strategy that TRCA has. And then we have our own Class EA, the Conservation Ontario Class EA, where erosion and flood control work is implemented. And the project we're going to speak to you today about was undertaken through the Conservation Ontario Class EA. So I'm going to give you some background first, and especially if you don't live in the city, this geography may be a little foreign to you. And I'm starting off with an historical photo. So you're seeing Ashbridges Bay Treatment Plant here. You will not see this today, and as we progress through the presentation, Jed is going to show you some imagery of how this landscape has transformed as we implement a number of EAs in the area. But this is the largest treatment plant in Canada. It services about 1.5 million people. It was built in the early 1900s, and you can see by this photo it's utilizing pretty much every square inch of the 95 hectares of property that it resides on. So as I get into our actual project itself, I'm setting this context of this is the landscape that we were really working with and some of the surrounding infrastructure that we had to consider. Other planning context for the area of this project is you probably have heard about remedial action plans. Toronto is designated as an area of concern. So we're constantly working towards improvements to the waterfront to delist this as an area of concern. We have the City of Toronto's Wet Weather Flow Management Plan, which was put in place in 2003. It's a 25-year implementation plan that's looking at addressing stormwater runoff, combined sewer overflows, and discharges to waterways for improvement to water health. And then at the last of the slide is where we get into how this project got so complex. So in this small geographic area that we were working with on a TRCA-related problem, there was 5 environmental assessments that were underway. And you can see the dates on this slide show them completing 2008, 2012. Well, some of these took a really long time to come to completion. So they were going on in the background for many, many years, looking at mostly infrastructure solutions. Most of these were led by Toronto Water. And then the last one I've highlighted on the bottom is our Ashbridges Bay Erosion and Sediment Control EA, which is the focus of our work. But we had all of these things going on around the project area and in the background that we need to consider how we integrate, how we maximize or we minimize environmental impacts overall from a cumulative effect, but how we also maximize our ability to work together with this other work for a number of efficiencies. I'm not a water resources engineer. This slide is here just to give you some more context about all of this crazy infrastructure you can see that was coming out of the wet weather flow in this area. Tunnels, we've got online storage tanks, and then we have an actual facility that they were looking to build at the Ashbridges Bay treatment plant, which will come into play when we look at the design of our preferred alternative. So, our environmental assessment. TRCA had a problem in the area that we were looking to address for many, many years. And we actually started the first environmental assessment for erosion and sediment control in this area in 2002. And halted that because we just couldn't figure it out when some of the other planning initiatives weren't yet further underway. But how this problem started is somewhat of a little bit of a human-created problem in that you can see by these two photos on the slides, we've got existing conditions of Ashbridges Bay in 1972, and in 1980 you can see we've got a headland that was built there for parkland purposes. Those of you that know a little bit about coastal processes, I don't want to use too many coastal terms, but the area between Bluffers Park, which is to the west in Scarborough, and Tommy Thompson Park, another man-made structure just to the east of this area, is essentially what we call the littoral cell for the coastal area. So sediment is moving between those 2 points. And we've got sediment coming from the beautiful Scarborough Bluffs sand sediment that is making its way down into this area. And unfortunately, what was happening with that sediment is that it was all settling into navigation channels in this area. TRCA, with the City of Toronto, does have the responsibility to maintain those navigation channels, and we've taken on a lot of roles through working with the city for dredging of some of these areas. So a little bit of a problem we've created ourselves with some of these other landforms that have happened, but it had become quite an issue in terms of just the operation of Ashbridges Bay treatment plant. It was extremely costly for us to be dredging these navigational channels on an annual basis. And we also had an issue that the shoreline in this area was highly eroded and really just kind of a mess of rubble. So we had a problem we wanted to identify. And we started in 2002 to look at this. It really took until 2019 where we were able to address it with all of these other things that were happening in the area. So this is where REA came into, sorry, I said 2019, 2014. I'm throwing around dates and totally out of context. But so the objective of our Class EA was to find a solution that dealt with our problem, so the sedimentation problem and the shoreline protection problem, while we considered all of the other planning initiatives in the study area. And what came out of that EA when it was finalized in 2014 was this design that you see on the slide here, where these dark green areas were really a result of our Class EA to address sediment and erosion issues, but it integrated other pieces of Toronto Water's previously approved EAs, which include building a facility just on a new land base off the property of Ashbridges Bay treatment plant. And the reason we landed on this solution is it really had the best potential for improved water quality results in this area. There is a lot of input from CSOs, and also we've got the seawall gates that are currently operating at the treatment plant, which will come offline very soon. But this design, we looked at water quality modeling, we looked at sediment quality or sediment modeling, and this design had positive impacts to both. And then, of course, we got at this issue of providing decades of safe navigation without ongoing maintenance and cost to dredging. This is just another contextual slide to see where the landform itself is situated. You've got Tommy Thompson Park just to the west, this large structure, and then Ashbridges Bay Park to the east, and then you may also be familiar just on the other east side of that is Woodbine Breach, if you've ever gone down to play beach volleyball or enjoyed the walking along the boardwalk there, you can see where this landform sits. So moving into detailed design, and this is where you'll see some of the things we've talked about over the last couple of days touched on in terms of the importance of early coordination of permits and approvals, and working with all levels of government to achieve that. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's really just showing how our concept from the environmental assessment evolved into detailed design, because really it's the next slide that I think is most significant in terms of what we were trying to achieve at Ashbridges Bay beyond our goals to address that problem statement. You can see in this slide where we looked at integrating habitat into the landform itself. So just to back up a little bit, from a permitting approvals perspective, one of the biggest permits that we had to challenge with or that we had to undertake with Ashbridges Bay was our Departments of Fisheries and Oceans permit. So TRC has long monitored this area from a fisheries perspective. It was not very productive habitat. Shoreline's very undiverse. There's no substrate, there's no aquatic vegetation. Where we were finding most of our fish communities were in the sheltered embayment by the yacht clubs and such. So kind of interesting, like they were going to hide there more or less. Not a productive fishery, but we still had 22 hectares of bottom area impact. So we had to find a way, even though our goal with this project was to overall improve fish habitat, we had a lot to compensate for in terms of our DFO permit. So we looked at putting as much habitat as possible on the site. In terms of some of these features you see, we've got offshore reefs, we've got submerged vegetation, we've got cobble beach, which provides that diversity of substrate for fish spawning, and off of our breakwater inside, we've got a little bit of a wetland feature at the base of that structure too. But we weren't actually we didn't get enough habitat on site. So this was our on-site aquatic habitat compensation, but we also had to compensate off-site to make up for that 22 hectares of impact that we had. This is just a little bit of a cross-section of some of the features that we had from a fish habitat perspective. And I apologize, a couple of these images are not super clear on the presentation, but we did do off-site compensation at both Toronto Islands and also Dufferins Creek Marsh. And you might say, that sounds really far away from your project site. This was a challenge. There were not a lot of opportunities for us to extend the off-site compensation very close to the project site itself. So it is kind of spread throughout the waterfront in terms of those impacts too, but we did compensate above and beyond what was required from the DFO permit. And then really lastly, to just demonstrate some of these layers of complexity that we dealt with in this project before I flip to Jed and he can show you the fun stuff in terms of our progression with construction and such. This is showing some of the layers of land ownership. So not only did we have regulatory permits, we had a number of landowners that we had to work with from an approvals perspective too. I mentioned we've got 22 hectares of bottom area for the landform, including the breakwaters too. The main landform itself is about 16.5 hectares. One thing that's happening here in terms of all these different colors you see is some of the water lot was owned by Toronto Region Conservation Authority, but some of it was owned by Ports Toronto and under a management agreement with City of Toronto for the operation of the treatment plant. So they had their own agreement. We've got little slivers of different pieces of this project that fall within that. So it's created a lot of kind of paperwork and legal work that we had to do to basically get us to the point where we got the landform into the right ownership for its future use. The one thing I will note that's a benefit that's come out of us not only achieving our erosion and sediment issues and some of the city's infrastructure issues is that through the public consultation process, we definitely heard that people wanted access to this landform. You saw the photo of the treatment plant before. It's actually really tight security there. Like, there's no way you could walk along the shoreline right now with where the treatment plant is. They've got really important infrastructure, and they don't want the public, just walking around the property. But working with Toronto Water, we're able to provide a shoreline trail that's going to connect with Tommy Thompson Park, which already has a very robust existing trail infrastructure, and we'll be able to give people access in front of the treatment plant that hasn't ever been accessible before. But the bulk of the landform itself, with the exception of our erosion and sediment control structures, will be used to fulfill various aspects of those 4 other environmental assessments that Toronto Water is undertaking to upgrade their infrastructure. So, Judd, I think this is where I'm going to flip to you to talk a little bit about the construction, some of our methodology, how it played into some of the other projects that are happening in the area. And we've got lots of cool aerial photos to show you how this work has progressed.
Hello, everybody. My name's Jet Taylor, as Lisa mentioned. And yeah, I'd like to thank Lisa for taking control of the more complex part of the presentation and leaving me with the fun part, mostly with aerial photos on how we progressed. But I'm going to start with more of a boring slide to help highlight the better slides in the future. All text-based, but then I've got a map after this, and then it's going to be all photos. So I kind of brought the text up here because I wanted to show the names of 3 other projects and some numbers, and kind of carry through the thread that Lisa talked about other initiatives in the area, finding integrated solutions and efficiencies with living in or having projects in a very dense area. So while we were working through everything that Lisa just talked about, all the planning, the detailed designs, the permitting, there was these 3 other Toronto Water tunneling projects in various life stages of the project life cycle. And so there was a big impetus to get all these 3 projects and the Landform project running at full capacity in a relatively similar time, because these are tunneling projects through bedrock generating shale, which we can use primarily to build this landform, about 14 hectares. So without the landform there to bring the shale material to, and these projects are within about 3-kilometer radius. One of them is our next door neighbor. They don't even need to go onto a municipal road to get to our site. But without the landform in existence, all this tunneling shale would need to be trucked off-site to various disposal facilities, most of which are outside of the GTA. Huge costs there financially, as well as environmentally. For context, we've accepted you can see their storage capacity of our landform, 756,000 cubic meters of shale. And right now we've brought in about 55 to 60,000 truckloads. So all of those truckloads are coming maximum 3-kilometer distance, some of them not even on municipal roads, rather than going 50 to 100 kilometers outside of the GTA, paying for disposal fees. So we're estimating approximate savings of about $20 million just on having the landform as the shale disposal facility. Next, Lisa showed some slides similar to this one, but this is more of our construction phasing plan. So before we start construction, obviously we like to have at least a little bit of a plan going in. So there's 2 main components, the landform and the 2 breakwaters. The 2 breakwaters are on the right of your screen. They're mainly for the sediment negation within Coatsworth Cut for the navigation channel there. Those are being built by a coastal contractor, so a barging operation, mainly because of the tight security that Lisa mentioned. You can see the central breakwater, the one in the middle there, the pink one. It connects to the treatment facility in an area of high security, and with a number of trucks we would need to bring in for a land-based operation, it was just too much for the treatment plant to take. So basically it was a non-starter from the beginning, and we were doing a barging operation for building these two. So kind of the way we went about the breakwaters, mainly we wanted to build the eastern breakwater first, which was the small one, and then start from the furthest tip of the central breakwater and build back towards the land, which may sound counterintuitive, but there's a couple of reasons. You sometimes need to dredge your way kind of in to place the core of it on the lake bed, but most primarily, you can kind of see from the image, we get a lot of easterly winds. Lake Ontario, you can get 250 kilometers of fetch, like wind building up speed coming from the east. So the central breakwater and eastern breakwater, if they're built from the tips back to the land, they actually provide a lot of erosion protection to the landform while the landform is in construction. So while the landform is in construction, that's obviously when it's most vulnerable to wave action, damaging construction as it's ongoing. So that's being taken care of by a barge contractor. TRCA is managing the contract. But conversely, the landform is being undertaken by TRCA staff. We have in-house construction services crews. So TRCA has been building this landform. We split it up into 3 cells for 3 different reasons. The first is we're not able to just put shale in the lake without first getting a confined disposal facility. So we need to isolate the work area from Lake Ontario before we start dumping shale in. Otherwise, there's negative aquatic impacts, as I imagine you can guess. So the kind of the highlighted areas around the cells are our confinement berms, and that's what we had to do first. So we've got cell 1, you'll notice, is much, much smaller than cell 2 and cell 3. And the second reason why it's set up like this is because some of those tunneling projects I talked about, they were already kind of going. And until we isolated these cells from Lake Ontario, we weren't able to accept that shale, and that shale was going outside of the GTA. So our first cell is small so that we could create that cell as efficiently as possible and start accepting the shale. But we also had to take into consideration that once material started coming to the landform, we didn't want to have to tell Toronto Water that it's got to go back out to the outside of the GTA. So we tried to maximize the size of cell 1 so that it wouldn't be full of shale before we'd completed cell 2 perimeter berm. So we wanted to have capacity to continue accepting shale throughout the duration of the project. And this is kind of what we ended up with. And then the third reason, I kind of alluded to it before, is while we're building this, it's subject to intense wave action, winter storms, and the longer berm is out within Lake Ontario, like you can see some of it is about 300, 400 meters out from the natural shoreline. It's deep out there, lots of wave action, and it's a lot more susceptible to being breached, destroyed, and if we tried to build one huge cell, we would be spending more time fixing the berm than we would be actually building it. So this is kind of what we came up with. That's kind of the body of the landform. There's also some other components coming off of it. So we have 4 headlands. It's kind of the blue T-shaped structures. They provide additional erosion protection to the landform, and they also, but mainly they protect cobble beaches that are in between those headlands. So kind of in the arced areas, those are going to be cobble beaches, which are erosion protection, and also provide modicum of aquatic habitat. Okay, I think I talked about most of those things, and now we'll get to some photos. So lucky for our construction crews, we had them start in the winter, actually in December of 2019. But this photo, you can see, so in order to create, I could have talked about it on the last slide, but in order to create cells as efficiently as possible, we wanted to come across it from both angles. So we didn't just build around, we built both out in both directions to connect kind of in the middle. So the first thing we did coming down our access road was just to start punching right out into the middle of the lake. And then you can see to the west, the top part of the photo, we also were building an access road so that we could come at it from the other side as well. So that's January 2020. By June of 2020, we'd completed the first cell, closed the first cell, and were able to start accepting shale. You can kind of see, let's see my mouse work, yeah. Right here, there's a little bit of boat launch here for 2 reasons. We have a safety boat here, but the other main reason is we have a Fisheries Act authorization, so we do a lot of fish monitoring, and one thing we want to make sure is that we're not trapping fish in these cells. So periodically when the cells are built, and then as we are filling them with shale and the cell becomes smaller and smaller, we do multiple runs of electrofishing and seine netting to remove captured fish and then place them out on the lake side of Lake Ontario. So that was, what was that? We were June 2020. And then by October of 2020, we'd close cell 2. And you can kind of see far in the background that a bunch of cell 1 is filled there. It's kind of hard to see. You can also see the CN Tower and downtown core in the background, giving context to how close we are to that major infrastructure. You can also see we have multiple things going on at once for a project of this size. We've got excavators here, we've got trucks coming down this arm, trucks coming on this arm. We have trucks coming in, building the berms, and we also have trucks coming in with the shale, filling the cells. We talked about the breakwaters. So the eastern breakwater, the smaller one coming off of Ashbridges Bay Park, was built completed in the first year. And about a year after starting, we'd filled cell 1. By May 2021, we'd filled cell 3, so this was kind of a big milestone. We'd isolated all the cells from Lake Ontario and connected back to the land base on the far east. So I don't know how well you get a sense of the scale of this from these photos, but I remember standing out at Tommy Thompson Park on this point way up here and looking at the tip there, and I couldn't believe that we were going to build something that encompassed that whole area. So it was pretty fascinating to see it coming together like this. And it might sound silly to say, but when it kind of popped up on Google Earth one day, there was no landform, and then all of a sudden on Google Earth there was a landform. That was pretty interesting to see. So while we were kind of filling the cells, we started building the headlands because they provide additional protection. So we didn't go with headland 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. We actually started with headland 3. We talked with our coastal engineer about which areas of the landform kind of required more erosion protection based on coastal conditions. We ended up going with headland 4. Headland 3 there, and then headland 2. And headland 1 actually connects to Tommy Thompson Park. And Tommy Thompson Park, if you don't know, it's heavily used by people. We like to keep people off of these dangerous construction sites as much as possible. So without headland 1 built, there's actually a moat between Tommy Thompson Park and our landform. So headland 1 is actually going to be the last thing we do, because once we actually connect to Tommy Thompson Park in that fashion, it's going to be a lot more difficult to keep people out. So cell 2 was mostly filled by the end of 2021. You can see we've kind of started filling cell 3, but we left a gap here in cell 2. And so this is kind of leads into probably the last integrated solution, other initiative parts that we'll talk about, because there was our large scale, very fascinating project. If you don't know about it, you should look it up. The Ashbridges Bay Treatment Plant, the outflow pipe that they've used for almost 100 years only goes out about half a kilometer into Lake Ontario. So there's another one nearly complete, if not complete now, that goes underneath our landform and out 3.5 kilometers through bedrock underneath the lake in Lake Ontario. And as part of that project, the last 500 meters, there's what are called risers, and they go up from the bedrock to the just the base, just above the base of Lake Ontario, and that's where the treated wastewater is released. So when they were installing those risers, they had to do a bunch of dredging of the sediment in that area to get their machines down there for the fitting of the risers. And so they talked with Toronto Water, and Toronto Water talked with us about what could be done about this dredging solution, because it's a bit difficult with these barges of these size to find ports to dock at, load onto trucks, and take to land disposal facilities. So we were able to leave that area in cell 2 and have the barge come right up to our cell. We have a pipe there through the berm, and they just pumped the sediment dredge from Lake Ontario 3 kilometers out into that corner of cell 2, and then we capped it with shale. Cell 3 we just filled this year. Cell 3 took a little bit longer because some of the tunneling projects were slowing down. They weren't generating as much shale. We had lots of other stuff to do. That wasn't a problem, but Cell 3 took a little bit longer to be filled. This was another kind of major milestone. The whole landform was filled, and now we're kind of working on just some fine grading parts of it and getting the compaction that's required for Toronto Water to build their expansion of their treatment plant. There you can see 3 of 4 headlands complete, with number 1 being in the background there that we're going to do at the very end. Haven't shown you the central breakwater yet, so this is kind of more recently, so it was done in iterations. Basically the whole core is put in, and right now the contractor is working on the heavy armor stones to go on top of that core material. And you can see one of the habitat components. Most of the habitat components for this project, they're underwater. You can't see very well, but you can see one just starting to be built here at the land-water interface, a little bit of a wetland, emergent, aquatic vegetation area. And then lastly, okay, comes up pretty good. Wasn't sure how well this one would come up. But this is what it looked like a couple months ago, so there's a little bit more work done. But I like this image because you can see all of it at once. I find it's a bit surreal out there walking on it. To me, it feels like I'm walking on the moon. It's all just the dark gray color. It's kind of dusty. It just feels like such a foreign experience to me, especially with the busy city in the background and the trees of Tommy Thompson Park. But as Lisa kind of talked about, it's obviously not going to look like this for too much longer. There's going to be the public trail piece along the perimeter by the water, and then the western area, kind of most of Cell 1 will be vegetated similar to the trees you can see in the background here. It'll be expansion of Tommy Thompson Park. And then the treatment plant facility will be, we're going to build some berms and some vegetation, so some visual break, both for the public's benefit and Toronto Water's benefit. So it's not going to be too much of an eyesore of a treatment plant facility thing. So it's going to look a lot nicer when we're done, but you can kind of start to get, or maybe you don't need, it's not a start, but you can get a good context of the size and scale of this. So that's it for the construction, and since I got the easy part, I'm going to keep it going and bring Lisa back up to bookend it and give a summary.
I'm sure you could have bookended this too, Jet, but just wrapping up, obviously, through everything we talked about today, finding a solution to our problem, so TRCA's problem, was really complicated due to all of these other EAs and infrastructure planning that was underway in the study area. We had some frustrations. This was our 3rd shot at the EA. It was not just 2002 we started, we gave it a shot in 2009 too, and we still couldn't reach a solution because there wasn't resolution on a lot of the other infrastructure planning. But by waiting to address this issue and working with Toronto Water to really find those net benefits that we could bring between all the projects, really what we have is the best uses of resources and minimizing environmental impacts and also social impacts too. And in the end, we have a landform that's going to meet the needs of a growing city from an infrastructure perspective, but also provide some public realm benefits and a new diverse fisheries and fish habitat in the area too. So that's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Jet. Excellent presentation. All right. Just going to get us set up. Next up, we have Brendan Middle, who's going to come up and give us a bit of a presentation about his research with qualitative methods for assessing projects in Canada. I'm going to get you set up here.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the OAIA, it's a lot of vowels, for the... I can hold it. So I want to thank OAIA for the opportunity to be here. They provided a little bursary, which is fantastic, and I came to you from Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6 territory. And my name is Brendan. I'm a master's student from the University of Manitoba Natural Resources Institute. And I'll be presenting just a few highlights from some of my master's research today, which is entitled Employing Qualitative Methods for Assessing Impacts of Major Projects in Canada. So the Impact Assessment Act 2019 is our Canadian example of the next generation of impact assessment. In addition to our usual biophysical requirements, we are seeing more explicit sustainability requirements and criteria to formulate some of the values we as a society would like to see reflected in the IA process. For a long time, there have been calls to see for more consideration of some of these things like cumulative effects, social well-being, positive and negative impacts to human health, climate change, impacts to Section 35 Indigenous rights, community knowledge, the list goes on. So the question is, how are we going to capture these considerations in a scientific and evidence-driven way in the IA process? So qualitative methods can bridge this gap for decision makers between traditional environmental assessment and considerations that require understanding human experiences and subjectivity. So the key is methods that require understanding human experience and subjectivity. And so qualitative methods are well established in the literature and have been applied for decades in the social sciences. Qualitative methods provide authoritative and replicable ways of gathering and analyzing data. They can provide evidence-based descriptions of complex social realities with verifiable results. And findings from qualitative methods research should also help with more well-informed decisions, which bring sustainability considerations into the fold. So I undertook my first qualitative research study exploring how qualitative methods from the social sciences contribute to the evolution of next generation of impact assessment in Canada. And this was part of a larger international research project that was also funded by the Impact Assessment Agency, entitled Qualitative Methods for the Next Generation of Impact Assessment. And it is complete, it's in circulation, it still hasn't been released by the agency yet as it's waiting translation, but you can find it online or connect with me and I can email it to you. But it's essentially a guide to 20 different groups of methods or methods, how to use them. So it's useful for qualitative practitioners, anybody in impact assessment, and it's meant to kind of be used however you would like if you're more interested in the theory behind it, or if you're more interested in the actual use of how do I use focus groups, how do I use fuzzy sets, how do I go about designing a workshop. That's kind of what it's meant for. And so part of my research was just looking at a handful of these in some Canadian contexts and case studies. So I conducted a preliminary document review and keyword search in the registry, the Federal Registry, and selected 2 case studies. One was BC Hydro's Site C Clean Electric Dam project, and the other one was Tech Frontier Mine in northern Alberta. I interviewed 21 practitioners on Zoom, and I reviewed dozens of publicly accessible documents that I organized and analyzed using a checklist that I found in the literature, which is called Creswell's Checklist for Designing Qualitative Research. So I'll just highlight a few of my findings. 2 of them are about methods involving interviews and focus groups, and then I'll end the presentation with a few challenges for designing qualitative methods in impact assessment. So I've also included a small selection of quotes just to kind of illustrate what my participants were saying about using and how to use qualitative methods. So first, I found interviews to be probably the most commonly used. Quote, so interviews are really more specific and they're like an individual's experience, end quote. It's a good definition there. Interviews are for exploring an individual's experience and delving into their values, motivations, beliefs, and relationships. The data from interviews can be aggregated to form a mosaic of representative experiences and knowledge. There are different ways of structuring interview questions and protocols to provide different ways of eliciting experiences and information. The quote above highlights this, quote, "Whatever you're using to record that interview is actually new information that is created from that social encounter." For example, one participant described using only a notebook, recorder, and pen while following their participants into field sites. Pretty simple. On the other hand, someone else described the mapping biography method, which is a lot more intensive and requires participants to locate experiences and locations on maps and photographs, aerial photographs, paper and digital. And so these interviews can take a lot of time, can take many hours in more enclosed office spaces, and take teams of 3 or more people involving a team of translators, cultural specialists, facilitators, and note takers. And so these 2 examples kind of emphasize how different protocols are necessary and appropriate based on the information needs that you have, the context, and the resources available to practitioners or the community. Focus groups, quote, "Focus groups we use more so in situations where we need to get at understanding an issue or a concern or a value," end quote. Focus groups seek to reconstruct collective experiences, knowledge, and values in targeted groups. Just like interviews, different protocols can also influence the type and the quality of information that's gathered. And I noted in one document that focus groups can be culturally relevant tools, especially for Indigenous partnered research, because of the shared collective process and similar cultural traditions for sharing information and making decisions. Because we work in the space of Indigenous interests and rights, which are holistic and connected, I guess there's so many complex relationships we need to use qualitative methods to make sense of what the local situations are. Very complex social, geopolitical type situations, as well as environmental changes that are happening that are affecting culture or livelihood or rights. So focus groups are well suited for understanding this type of complexity, and they're great tools for validating, verifying, and triangulating qualitative data. I also found that using multiple qualitative methods in a multi-phase approach was really common for practitioners who wanted to triangulate that data. For example, phase 1 would be interviewing, and then followed that up by phase 2 of focus groups, which would then verify interview data and the successive focus group data. So you have kind of an iterative process for triangulation. So just to highlight a few of the challenges that I found regarding the design of qualitative methods in impact assessment. Managing data ownership and confidentiality is really important. It's important to understand who has intellectual rights over the data, and this includes respecting and maintaining confidentiality of it through time, and being sensitive to how participants consented to its use, and whether it will be accessible to them in the future. And relationships, this has come up a few times, relationships matter at every scale, and within the context of implementing qualitative methods, for example, focus groups, understanding the relationships between participants and other power dynamics, which can influence what participants will share and the quality of that information. Partnering with a community also relies on trust and co-designing or collaborating with Indigenous people, which is one way to establish these relationships and trust. Human experiences matter. When collecting and analyzing data, it's important to avoid minimizing the experience of participants. Valued environmental components, VEX, impacts, they're not usually how people think of their experiences in everyday life. For example, you can't simply ask someone, tell me the impact of this road on your culture. As one participant said, impacts are experienced all at once. And last, sampling. Sampling can be really difficult in communities, especially those affected by research fatigue, and especially smaller ones. Communities are really busy places and have lots of planned and unplanned events on the go, and these can be sensitive to the disruption and conflict with regulatory schedules. The same can be said for the amount of times that elders or land users are interviewed over and over again, while often youth can be left out, despite the fact that they'll be the ones most affected in the mid to end life of long-term projects. And so just to conclude with a few thoughts, qualitative methods provide the means of integrating some of these broader considerations into impact assessment, and they have a track record in the literature, and in some of these contexts that I've found, they're beginning to be used well in the Canadian context, and they are important because qualitative methods can reduce delays through proper placement and screening of some of these social concerns at the beginning of the process. And that's all I have. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, we have a much larger report that's much more marketable than my thesis, but I can also send that to you when it's done. And I just finished with the checklist that I kind of used for designing qualitative methods. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Next up, I'd like to welcome Fabiana Palacios from AECOM to come and give us a presentation on quantitative approaches in this context of carbon life cycle assessment and decarbonization.
I'm very short for this. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on a quantitative approach to carbon life cycle assessment and decarbonization of infrastructure projects. So for today, we'll begin with a short background on the impacts of the infrastructure sector and how, based on the MECP's guidance, we can assess the impacts on and off climate change for future projects. Next, we'll discuss how a climate change and environmental impact assessment can be done with one of AECOM's projects as an example. We will then touch on how certain municipalities are currently protecting the environment and delivering climate action with their climate action plans. Lastly, we will finish off with AECOM's approach on net zero and decarbonization strategies. But first, a little introduction. My name is Fabiana Palacios. I'm an air quality specialist at AECOM. My background is environmental engineering, but my work mainly focuses on air quality compliance and environmental impact assessments for a variety of clients in Ontario. So let's first walk through some background information. The infrastructure sector plays a key role in delivering climate action and sustainable development. The United Nations Environment Program, alongside the University of Oxford, found that infrastructure is responsible for 79% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and the largest sources of these emissions are found in the energy, transport, and building sectors. And these emissions can originate from various stages of the infrastructural life cycle. For example, in the construction phase, we would see emissions embodied in construction materials such as cement and steel, as well as in the energy required to transport these materials and workers to building sites. Then when we move to the operational and maintenance phase, we see the emissions embodied in the operation of the asset itself, as well as in the use of equipment required for its maintenance and eventual decommissioning. And these increased emissions have resulted in a rapid acceleration of global anthropogenic climate change and warming of the climate system. And all of this just highlights the need for us to transform the way we plan, manage, and operate infrastructure in the future. But before anything, it is important we review the MECP's guide for considering climate change in an environmental assessment process. This guide covers the consideration of the impacts of the project on climate change, the impacts of climate change on a project, and various means of identifying and minimizing negative impacts during project implementation. First, let's outline the differences between qualitative and quantitative considerations. So for qualitative considerations, we want to identify and document measures that could contribute to climate mitigation and reduce GHG emissions from the project. And for quantitative, we not only want to work on the first 2 pointers we just mentioned, but also quantify the project's GHG emissions and the potential avoided emissions that might come from implementing the project, both with mitigation measures considered and no mitigation measures considered. Now, as I mentioned, in an environmental assessment process, both the potential impacts of climate change and non-climate change must be considered. So let's first start with potential impacts of climate change. Here we'll look at how vulnerable the project is to a changing climate throughout its life cycle. So we would consider existing project plans, historical and present climate data, climate projections, and the effect of variations on climate parameters. Then we would evaluate how the project may affect the surrounding environment's ability to be resilient and maintain its adaptive capacity to climate change. This could be done by examining the effect of projected changes in temperature or precipitation when the project is implemented compared to if it was not implemented. So overall, when considering the impacts of climate change on a project, we should keep in mind that the environmental effects of a project may be even greater when coupled with projected climate changes considered. Now, when considering the potential impacts on climate change, we could assess the expected direct and indirect GHG emissions from the project. And next, we would consider alternative methods to project implementation to reduce its GHG emissions or any negative impacts on carbon storage. This may include aspects of the proposed project scheduling, footprint, or operation. We will also need to have special considerations on where the project could affect Indigenous communities and interests. And finally, during the project planning phase, we could consider technology developments that could overall reduce the impacts from the project. Now, for the climate change mitigation and adaptation process, we will have a look at a specific project where this assessment was applied. For the climate change mitigation aspect, an assessment of environmental impacts was carried out for a controlled access freeway known as the Bradford Bypass. And the purpose of this assessment was to determine the impacts of the project on GHG emissions within the study area, which extended from Highway 400 in Bradford West Willenbury to Highway 404 in East Willenbury. The operational life cycle of road projects such as the Bradford Bypass are typically anticipated to have the greatest impact on GHG emissions from the adjustment to traffic due to the project. So a traffic analysis was performed comparing existing conditions during 2019, then future conditions without the construction of the Bradford Bypass in 2041, and future conditions including the Bradford Bypass. And there are potential mitigation actions that can be implemented during the design and contracting phases, including sourcing low carbon alternatives for material selection and sourcing materials from local suppliers. However, it is important to note that although local and regional materials may benefit in terms of the impact of long transportations, they could have negative effects on performance if those materials result in poor durability, safety, or service life. So materials with higher initial embodied carbon could have a lower net embodied carbon throughout the life of the project if they result in better durability and don't require any repair or replacement. So by designing projects that not only use less materials, but use those materials more efficiently, the overall impact of the project can be reduced. And for this project, actions were proposed for each stage of the project, such as renaturalizing, so introducing vegetation along the highway, shrub and tree planting following the end of the construction phase. Then sourcing sustainably manufactured materials such as low carbon concrete and using recycled materials such as recycled asphalt pavement. And also the implementation of high occupancy vehicle lanes on the Bradford Bypass to promote the use of carpooling and avoid single occupant vehicles. Now for the climate change adaptation, a climate change resilience assessment was done to provide input and direction for the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of the project. This assessment typically involves adopting a risk management approach to anticipate climate change-related risks that may have an impact on the project and identify potential design features or actions to help address these risks. This was done to following the 5 key steps described by the ISO risk management standard, so establishing the context, risk identification, risk analysis, risk treatment, and adaptation measures, as well as considered the MSCP guide for considering climate change and environmental assessment process. So first, historical climate data was analyzed based on temperature and precipitation observations at the Toronto Pearson International Airport weather station that was needed for the next steps that we'll talk about. Now for climate change projections, since future global emissions of GHGs and other pollutants are uncertain, 4 scenarios with different GHG concentration trajectories were included, and these trajectories, or called representative concentration pathways, range from very low to very high future concentrations. And those numerical values of the RCP, so from 2.6 to 8.5, aim to represent the atmospheric concentrations estimated for 2100. And the higher values mean higher greenhouse gas emissions, which means higher global temperatures and more pronounced effects of climate change. And then lower RCP values would mean lower emissions, but would require more stringent climate change mitigation efforts in order to achieve them. Now, a climate indicator represents a climate condition or a type of event by which the evaluated infrastructure would be significantly affected. It could be from resulting in loss of productivity or damage to the actual infrastructure. These climate indicators are selected based on past events, probability of occurrence in the future, or showing a trend to reflect the reality of the project. And the probabilities of occurrence for each climate indicator was calculated using that historical climate data and future climate projections provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada and Canadian Centre for Climate Services, as well as ACOM's climate data analysis tool. These probabilities were then converted into a score from 1 to 5, as shown on the table. Now, for risk analysis, a project's risk of climate change is determined by the severity of the consequence on the assets and the probability of climate variables in a changing climate. So to estimate the level of consequences, 3 impact categories were identified based on the most important aspects of the project. So these aspects were on health and safety, infrastructure integrity, and operational impacts. Then the risk analysis is determined from the combination of severity and probability ratings. Severity is evaluated based on the vulnerability of the element of interest, and vulnerability depends upon the sensitivity of the element and its adaptive capacity. Therefore, the severity score does not solely represent the consequence, but it also integrates the consequence upon the occurrence, its adaptive capacity, and the degree to which the element is affected by the impact, meaning its sensitivity. And then the factor of probability is taken into account to estimate this risk. In this table on the right demonstrates the potential impacts and proposed adaptation measures that were taken for the overall Bradford bypass design, construction, operation, and maintenance. The adaptation measures were based on high-level risks originating from the adverse impacts of climate change during the construction and life cycle of this infrastructure. This is just a few of the points, but there were many, many adaptation measures as it was a big project. Now let's have a look at a couple of municipalities' climate action plans. There are at least 52 provincial and municipal climate action plans across Canada, but for this presentation, we'll look at 2 in Ontario, Mississauga's and Kingston's climate action plans. So Mississauga's action plan focuses on GHG emissions from buildings mainly, as they account for 52% of the city's emissions, with their goal of reducing emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And a few other points of actions included reducing GHG emissions from existing and newly developed buildings, integrating climate change considerations into municipal park standards, and investing in low carbon and fuel emission modes of transportation, to accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles and enhance the walkability of the community. Now for Kingston's action plan, it focuses mainly on climate adaptation and mitigation actions with the intention of making Kingston a carbon-neutral city by 2040. And a few other points of actions included accelerating local production of renewable and low carbon energy through the installation of solar panels on all new municipal buildings, roof replacements, or any other major renovations. Then supporting residents to invest in low carbon home energy retrofits through financial programs or rental programs. Then educating on new low carbon buildings. This includes also the city's building inspectors and training them and enhancing design policies. And then developing infrastructure to locally produce renewable natural gas and increase the diversion of organic waste. Now let's finish off with how AECOM's been implementing net zero and decarbonization strategies. AECOM has been working with entities across the transportation and the infrastructure sector to build resiliency and sustainability for future projects. And throughout the project lifecycle, we have multiple opportunities to reduce and avoid carbon. For example, at the early stages of the project during the planning phase, alternatives can be explored to try and maximize the use of existing assets rather than building new ones. This approach would allow us to get to that 80% CO2 reduction and in some cases 100% reduction if nothing is built and emissions might be avoided completely. Now during the design stages, a design's embedded carbon can be optimized by carefully considering material usage and constructability, which can help us achieve that 50% reduction. Then for construction stages, we can use low carbon construction practices, as we mentioned, eliminate waste and monitor compliance with low carbon specifications. Finally, during the operation of a building or an infrastructure, we can optimize the operational use, considering energy efficient systems. So here we're seeing how the earlier in the process we engage in decarbonization strategies, the more potential impact we can make. And I will go through these three projects where we have been able to apply some of these strategies throughout different stages of the life cycle. So for this sustainable pavement project in Sydney, Australia, it focused on how we can use material assemblies to deliver decarbonized infrastructure. The city of Sydney wanted a sustainable solution to a busy 4-lane road where the road slabs were cracked and faulty, resulting in noise complaints. And even though 70% of the slabs were faulty, removing and replacing them all would have required a large amount of concrete mix. Therefore, an alternative solution was proposed, requiring only the replacement of 15% of the slabs, and instead installing new curb and gutter, an asphalt overlay, and an asphalt reinforcement grid. This significantly improved the ride quality of the road, addressing the noise complaints. So this project serves as an example of using low carbon alternatives during the design and construction stages with carbon savings equivalent to the average annual energy use for over 10 households. Now for the Suffolk County project, Suffolk County wanted to achieve net zero for the Suffolk County Community College STEM Center. So we designed a state-of-the-art net zero building with several energy saving strategies and tools incorporated throughout. For example, the windows use high-performance glazing, improving thermal insulation. A sloped roof was also equipped with solar panels tilting towards the south, maximizing energy production of the panels while also reducing the solar exposure of south-facing windows. And lastly, a center berm was added to provide insulation and serve as a green roof as well. So with these strategies implemented, the facility can produce enough solar and geothermal energy to make it self-sustaining with up to 100% carbon reduction. For our last project, Leicestershire County Council wanted a low-cost model to test policies prior to more detailed and more expensive modeling. Therefore, AECOM developed the Carbon Swift Assessment tool for transport to demonstrate the impact on emissions for each scenario on different parts of the road network and vehicle types. This low-cost model allows for an analysis of the comparative impacts of choices to inform policymaking without requiring detailed transport modeling times and data. So we compare the carbon impacts of 3 high-level scenarios against a baseline for carbon emissions. The first scenario A was increasing proportion of electric vehicles, scenario B, reducing car usage, and scenario C is increasing electric vehicles for freight and buses. Now, the insights from these scenarios helped LCC to refine its policies to reduce carbon in their mandated local transport plan. Now, we're just at the beginning with incorporating net zero and decarbonization strategies for large-scale infrastructure, but there is a lot of opportunities for mitigation for future projects in Ontario that we should not miss out on. Thank you very much for your time.
Stay close. Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to welcome Ian Stewart from the University of King's College up for a presentation on coastal zone management and adaptation and how impact assessment can be a resource for that, or a tool. All right.
Okay, I can't believe I'm the last speaker. I'm so amazed that any of you are here. Can you put that down there?
This.
Down there. Will it work? Perfect. I'm going to read from here. Does that work? I feel like I should tell you all to stand up and do some yoga or something just to get going. So it's. Does that work? Oh, awesome. So it's that. Okay. These never work for me, so if this works, this will be good karma. So my talk was emergency management or something, which is, I'm not going to talk about emergencies at all, but there's a relation to climate change. So just very quickly, most of you won't know me. I'm a professor of humanities in Halifax. I'm gate crashing this event, and I'm going to be talking about the East Coast a little bit, but more generally. I'm a philosopher and a historian of science, and I co-chair a project called NADIA that Michael Grassi talked about, that's funded by OAIA, the network of expertise and dialogue on impact assessment. It was trying to flesh out of the weeds the scholarship in social sciences and humanities in Canada that could be relevant to, but doesn't know it yet, to impact assessment. So I'm at the tail end of that project, and I've learned a lot. But in general, I'm interested in the knowledge challenges that all the way from data to wisdom across biophysical and social science and humanities fields, which is why your project is so important, and how these challenges are framed and solved in interdisciplinary contexts, and also how they are governed. So impact assessment is a rich field for those of us interested in studying theoretically how knowledge actually works. Impact assessment is an amazing field. Includes law, but also the practitioners and what practitioners are actually doing. I find practitioners are amazingly reflective about what's going on in this complex space of impact assessment, and I've learned a lot from not only this conference, but all of you. I also do have a chance to be a consultant for a company, Nexus Coastal Resource Management. I've done a few IA-related consultancy gigs. So I'm going forward, I'm going to be focusing research, hopefully funded by either SSHRC or the agency or somebody, looking at how impact assessment is actually an all-of-government reality, at least at the federal level, not beyond, situated within federal authorities and across federal authorities, sometimes coordinated and assisted by the agency. In the part of the world that I come from, Atlantic Canada, coasts and oceans are the dominant reality. So impact assessment means DFO, NRCan, Canada Energy Regulator, Transport Canada, of course, ECCC, Parks Canada, but also other hybrid regulatory bodies like the Canada Nova Scotia and Canada Newfoundland offshore boards, now called the energy boards. So let's see if this works. Does that work? Am I going the wrong way? Just want to acknowledge some of the folks that I have consulted in this, for this, and also numerous conversations at this event, which were helpful. Okay, so my topic is sections 81 to 91 of the Impact Assessment Act, projects on federal lands. And I could not have known what a hot topic that would be, because it literally is the part of the act that is left, that is still constitutional, based on the majority view of the SCCC. I didn't know that. To quote the majority opinion, the federal government can consider all potential impacts of the projects it undertakes or funds and makes decisions about those projects. So there's a class of projects that are described in sections 81 to 91 of the Act. And these are the parts that were left as constitutional by the majority opinion. And I'm having a hard time seeing what I'm doing here. But what is a federal authority? A federal authority is defined this way. I won't go over those in detail, but the key point that I want to note here is that the word, oh, that's fantastic, thank you. That's, wow. Is the word determination. Determination is the term that is used in that part of the Act, impact assessment, 81 to 91 of the Act. These are not assessments, they are determinations. So, and this linguistic index is intentional by the lawmakers to set some daylight between what happens in sections 81 to 91 of the Act and the rest of the Act, right? This is actually intentional. I also want to stress that the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has an advisory role at this point in the Act, because this is an Act that is this is a part of the Act in which federal authorities are the key players. So this is what a federal authority is, and there are over 75 of them that are subject to these requirements, including federal departments, departmental corporations, agencies, crown corporations, port authorities, and, as I mentioned, the offshore boards. So what is a project in this, under the POFL, or as I'm calling, Projects on Federal Lands, that is undertaken? So it's a physical activity that takes place within the context of physical work that is situated on federal lands. And POFL, if I can use that abbreviation, may I? POFL determinations sit, so not assessments, POFL determinations sit in that space between the more serious projects for which the Impact Assessment Act specifies an IA process, you know, the factors in section 22 of the Act. It sits between those kinds of projects, those kinds of, the thing we normally associate with federal impact assessments, and the vast space of activities and projects on federal lands that never get recorded by any process outlined by the Act. These are detailed in section 88 of the Act, which specifies a vast array of things that are so minor as to simply not get on our radar. Now, projects on federal lands are that category of activities that fit in between those two extremes, listed in section 88, which is designated classes of projects order. Now, the point is that the vast amount of work that's done on federal lands is so insignificant as to not even be worthy of consideration. And now the other end is the really serious stuff, the stuff that's listed in the project list. And then there's everything else in between. So all projects on federal lands are by definition projects that are not on that designated list or the physical activities regulations, for which the standard IA process applies. So how many of these are there? Well, if you go on the registry, this is how many there are. This is actually already out of date because I keep getting added every day, right? So my RA produced this little pie chart for me last week and it's already out of date. But you get a sense of the numbers of these. Determinations, they're not assessments. I called them an assessment by mistake. And here, and divided up by province. And interesting tidbit, they're overwhelmingly or disproportionately they occur on coastal territories, areas, provinces, by about 2 times 5x the proportion of by population. So what kind of events, what kind of authorities are engaged in these? Well, in Nova Scotia, just to produce a pie chart for Nova Scotia, this is the distribution. So DFO, not surprisingly, DND, Parks Canada, Transport Canada, and then on to smaller numbers, right? So oil and gas, large infrastructure, very, very low on the list in Atlantic Canada for interesting reasons having to do with what are and are not federal lands. So, and the nature of the activity, right? For this, again, just to take Nova Scotia, since that's what I'm looking at, you can see that a lot of it is basically basic kinds of infrastructure about building and adapting buildings, fixing ports, dredging harbors, very basic stuff, which is why for most people throughout up to very recently, projects on federal lands, the stuff of the Act covered by sections 81 to 91, were really off people's radars because these were very small, not really significant projects done in-house by federal authorities. Since the Act came into force in 2019, they are recorded on the registry. With the previous SIA 2012, federal departments just had to basically write an annual report describing what they did. They are on there, so there's a huge step forward with the Impact Assessment Act 2019. So we know about them, right? But they're still very much off the radar. And the question that I want to raise is what does that mean going forward? And particularly for climate change adaptation and mitigation plans for which impact assessment processes, I would say, wherever they're done, either by IAC or by departments, is a really important step. What does that mean, given that the vast majority of impact assessments that are carried out are this type? So where is the projects on federal lands managed, as it were, in the org chart? It's over there, right? Not way over on the right, which is where a lot of the operational stuff happens for the things we normally think about as impact assessments. And what are these determinations determining? Well, it's essentially a very simple determination. The authority determines that the carrying out of the project is not likely to cause significant adverse effects, or if it is, B, the governor and council has to justify going ahead with the project. So what you have here is a very distinct kind of assessment going on in this world, in which environmental effects are defined differently than the rest of what we think of impact assessment under the new Act. Environmental effects means changes to the environment, and it is entirely biophysical environment. And the impact of those changes on the environment, on Indigenous peoples of Canada, and the impact of those environmental changes on health, social, economic conditions. So you have a model here which is quite old and traditional. You have a project, you have an impact on a biophysical environment, and then you have impacts on the basis of changes on that biophysical environment on Indigenous peoples and on economies, on health, on social conditions, or whatever one's measuring. So, in other words, this is not what many of us heralded as a step forward under the new Act, which is a consideration, a broader understanding of what we mean by impact, as meaning both direct impacts of projects on social conditions, on economic conditions, on health conditions. But it's via the impact on the environment itself, and that is the doorway through which we can look at anything else. So it's very limited, and by definition, right? So these are factors D and E at the beginning of the health, which it's not this, right? You can see the definition there for the new Act. Now, why am I stressing this? Because the mitigation, which we'll see is the key question there, in relation to the concept of significant adverse effects. Pivots is the key pivot logical concept in these assessments. Not unlike other assessments, but in a way which is very central. We all know what we mean by mitigation. This is this well-known image from Alan Ehrlich and Alan Ehrlich and, what's Ross's first name? Bill, yeah. This paper, which many of us have seen, the whole idea that mitigation is the sort of activity that can take something that is potentially adverse and bring it into to the domain of okay or not significant, right? So this is so much woven into the intellectual warp and woof of impact assessment that we kind of glaze over this. We think it's I don't think it's a very clear concept sometimes. Often in impact assessment documents, I'm a student of language and of concepts and how the language carries concepts and carries power. I often find that mitigation as a term is used rhetorically as a way to signal that everything's good here because there's a mitigation. not just conceptually and logically, conceptually and logically, the presence of the notion of mitigation entails the presence of a real adverse effect. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about the need for mitigation. But it becomes a kind of, it's okay. There's an adverse effect, we know it's there, but we're all right because we're in the safe space of mitigation. And I think that the term, with respect, does operate that way in the POFL determination documents that I've been able to get my hands on. Now, this is how it works logically in the system. This is from the guidance document of the Impact Assessment Agency, the federal lands team. This is only a guidance document. Federal authorities aren't required to do this, but it does lay out, as it were, the logic, the decision tree that is that they do follow, adapted to their own purposes. And the key point here is that if, I don't know if you can see that, it's probably too small, but if a project has a mitigation that goes along with it, that is well known, then basically you can say, no, there's no adverse effects, we're good. If the mitigation associated with that project, however small, however big, is not quite so secure, is maybe testing the boundaries of what we know, then you have to go to a more, slightly more advanced kind of assessment, and that's the assessment. So this is the first kind, basically the simple kind. If you know what the effective and established mitigation measures that are, you're good to go. And then you get that determination. If you're not quite certain, then you have to do the yes channel and do something a little bit more complicated in which you specify for yourself, again, this is a guidance document, what degree of mitigation and how effective they will be. It's, in a sense, box checking. We know this logic. It works in all kinds of contexts, and many people use it effectively. Now, out of the 155 completed projects on federal lands in the Nova Scotia context that we summarized in our research of the registry, none of them noted significant adverse effects. And this is apparently standard in the field of projects on federal lands determinations. None of them note significant adverse effects. 37 of them do mention that mitigation measures are needed in order to say there are no adverse effects. But in none of those cases is it clear how the mitigation brings you from the right side of the Ehrlich line to the left. There's no clarification about how mitigation is actually doing that. Now, given the pressure on projects like this to come up with a no significant adverse effects, because otherwise the Governing Council has to come up with a reason why it's okay. Even at a very small scale, you have a context in which the mitigative power of the mitigation measures that are in place is the focus of these determinations. And it is, to me, odd, given the importance of mitigation, that in the actual documentation that at least that you find on the registry, there's no clear causal story about how the mitigation actually leads to a determination of no significant effects, in a way that we have quite understandably become used to being necessary for proper impact assessments. Well, then what happens after this kind of decision tree? Posting of a determination happens on the registry. This is a big improvement from the previous act. Mandatory 30-day window of consultation. Again, the comments that are supplied don't have to be posted. And even though Indigenous knowledge, community knowledge, and comments received from the public have to be considered in the determination, all that the federal authority has to post, according to the law, is what's the decision, significant effects, not significant effects, and what mitigation measures it took into consideration. Now, often the mitigation measures that were taken into consideration to continue this theme are not actually described. Not only is the causal story not described, but the actual mitigation measures that were considered are not described. This is an example which is typical from a Craft Harbor in Shelburne County, Nova Scotia. Shelburne County is on the south tip of Nova Scotia, in case you don't know. And the proponent and the authority are one and the same. In this case, Fisheries, Small Craft Harbors, Division of Fisheries Oceans Canada. And we're talking here about 40,000 tons of seabed being basically let out into the ocean a few kilometers away from the harbor that's being dredged, about 26,000 cubic meters. And the notice of determination simply states that no significant effects with mitigation measures as outlined in their evaluation. Where's the evaluation? You have to basically either request DFO for the document or FOIA pop it. So just to sum up, we find here in this, the only bit standing of the Impact Assessment Act of Canada, the only bit that's left that's constitutional, we have a very, what most of us in the impact assessment field would regard as a very traditional approach to impact assessment in terms of the concept of what is an environment and what is an impact. That, right? That the impacts besides simply biophysical are only interpreted through the lens of what is the change to the environment. The logic of mitigation has become very central, is very central to this kind of, but the record of it, the actual thought that's gone into it is not recorded, at least on the registry for public viewing. What's the impact of this on cumulative effects? Well, why would you worry about a cumulative effects assessment for such tiny, small projects that are barely worth even making their way on the registry? Because as cumulative effects scholars have long noted, cumulative effects assessments depend upon the patient consideration of small things adding up. And if we simply restrict our attention to cumulative effects assessment to the big, sexy projects, then we'll miss the boat. The discipline of being faithful in small things affects and leavens the whole process of impact assessment. And a culture in which we are actually as fulsome about our attention to the small details as possible and as transparent in that information sharing is surely a culture that would be a bedrock or a foundation for cumulative effects assessment when things get a lot tougher. That would be my suggestion. There's a great deal of responsibility placed upon federal authorities. And some of them have more or less experience with impact assessment. I'll share a slide in the very next one from Parks Canada, which has a very developed impact assessment process and is quite fulsome in sharing what that is to the public. But the impact assessment agency's job is to encourage these, to facilitate. But are there other ways in which a cooperation between federal authorities, within and between federal authorities can be established? And so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about how impact assessment, which exists across authorities, can actually, outside of government, be encouraged to get stronger together. And lastly, what about the larger projects that snuggle up close to the boundary, separating projects on federal lands from the so-called major standard list projects? What about those projects that are on the edge of making their way on the project list but don't? I'm told by people who work in this field that in the last few months, it's become very much on the radar of some federal authorities that projects on federal lands actually are actually much more significant than we used to think. An example would be large wind farms, large solar farms on Indian reserves. Those are projects on federal lands. They're not on the list of projects that trigger a major IA. But here's another example. Nova Scotia is considering offshore wind in a major way. It's in the middle of a regional assessment. And all that green is federal waters. But if you look at the bays, the white bays, I don't know if this works as a button, but you can see there's white along the coast of, those are provincial bays, right? So what happens, as has already happened in some projects on federal lands, if you have a major, any wind farm that is greater than 10 turbines, it makes its way onto the project list, the big IA. But what happens when there are projects with fewer than 10 turbines? Or what happens when, which is very likely, you have a large wind farm which is mostly on provincial bay, but some of it is on the federal lands, right? Now, the point is that major energy projects can actually make their way into the projects on federal lands type of determinations. And especially in things like offshore wind, I can tell you in the East Coast, this is very much a nascent field of impact assessment. If you talk to the folks from CWS, the Canada Wildlife Service, they will tell you that we know very little, and by we, I mean the world community, know very little about the real impacts of major offshore projects on things like migratory birds, species at risk birds. And one of my students is doing a study on the potential impacts on the very lucrative inshore lobster industry in Nova Scotia. So all these things suggest to me that projects on federal lands, I would recommend to the impact assessment community that this is something that we need to think about together more. So thank you. I forgot to thank SHIRC and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada that have made this research possible, so that's why I just reminded that at the bottom of that slide.
Just do a test of the mics. Yeah.
Hello.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. We're going to move into our Q&A period. We've got about 15 minutes to take some questions, and that's on questions for session 8 and 9. So we've got 5 presentations and hopefully plenty of questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll come around with a mic, and we'll get started.
Thanks. I want to go back to session 8 and health impact assessments. And I know many of us in the room probably have some experience engaging communities on controversial topics or maybe even emotional topics, but health is something that I think is like, you know, kind of different and in particularly, you know, sensitive and very personal. And so I'm wondering, how does that engagement look different from how we might typically engage communities? And there was a comment about confidentiality too, and that I was wondering about that too, because we often think of health information as not just confidential, but like particularly confidential, right? So I'm wondering how you manage that.
Thank you. That's a great question. So when we do health impact assessments, we don't just automatically first jump to collecting primary data, right? So first we try to take a look at what secondary data is available with regards to, like, you know, for health of a particular population in a study area. Are there Statistics Canada results, community well-being studies? If it's a regional municipality, have they done a baseline health profile? Like, what information is available? So that's how we start off. So looking at this kind of information, you start to get a picture in terms of, you know, how, you know, the community is doing overall. What are some health issues that may exist? So the next step then is to sort of like speak with key service providers or speak to public health professionals. So I'll right now speak to you know, experiences within non-Indigenous communities, and I'll move to how it sort of works with Indigenous communities. So speaking with key service providers, public health professionals, you get a more general, a better picture as to how some population groups may be disproportionately impacted as a result of XYZ already, and who may experience exacerbation of those impacts when it comes to this particular project. So, you know, with that kind of information, what you can then do is sort of speak with, you know, sort of the affected stakeholders and then sort of ask them, you know, if we would like to get more information and get perspectives related to this topic from folks, who could we speak to? who would it be safe to speak to and gather more information? Are these the questions that we should be asking? Right, like, are these safe questions? And if we do need to speak with, some individuals about sensitive topics, do we need to have sort of resources present in that area with us at the time that can help support them if it triggers something? And it goes without saying that when you're dealing with sensitive subjects related to health and well-being and sort of safety comes into that, you have to use trauma-informed approaches and sort of have knowledge in terms of how some individuals may be triggered even by questions that have like similar, like words that sort of bring them back to what they've experienced. So moving on to how this works with Indigenous communities is again the same thing. Start off with what secondary information is available, right? Sometimes this is very dated. There's not a lot of scan information available. It does not really represent a particular community. And we don't want to take a pan-Indigenous approach by assuming that, sort of what we've seen from one Indigenous community is applicable to all, right? So we start looking at secondary data, and then we sort of, start with engaging the community directly. But we first go with community members who have a better understanding of how the community is. So what is their health and social services department? Can we speak to someone there, right? We would like to collect some primary data to better inform this project. Who could we speak to? How do you suggest we speak with them? Should it be one-on-one? Should it be a focus group like in a setting? Or should it be sort of like a more open house like this where we're talking over a meal, people are eating, people are throwing comments here and there, and it's more general and sort of informal. And it doesn't focus on one particular person or group. Right? So like all of those things are you have to think through that, and every community is different. So, it's sort of like test the waters. When you go in, speak with some counselors, speak with health counselors if they have them on the team, speak with social counselors, and try and sort of gauge the waters. How can we talk to them? Is it possible? Right? Is virtual interviews where you don't really need to use a camera, and people can sort of be, cloaked behind a black screen, and then they can share their perspectives with you. So, and then sort of how do you protect that data? Obviously, so any information you collect from Indigenous communities is covered under OCAP. So it is their data, it is their information. And whether or not any of that goes into an environmental assessment is determined by them. So those are sort of some considerations, but obviously just, being prepared. You're speaking with elders, and you're discussing the topic of colonization, residential schools. So those are really, really intricate subjects. In that scenario, is it better to speak with individual elders? How do you speak with them? How do you even approach them? Is it better to speak with a group of elders, right? Like, and having trauma-informed approaches, having someone on hand from the community who can help support the individuals with whom you are speaking. And last but not least, having support for yourself and your own team when you've done this kind of engagement to help you with whatever fallback there is from that. It's really hard to be in a room and listening to someone go through their traumas and their experiences and how their life has changed and is changing. And that can affect you, right? So like that sort of support, that level as well is also important to consider. So different things.
Thanks for that response. Anything else to add from the panel? Excellent. Do we have another question?
I have a question if you don't mind.
All right, go for it, Nat.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have a question for Brendan, and thank you for your work. I'm looking forward to reading the report. I'm curious, you presented methods like interviews, focus groups, you mentioned like fuzzy models. And I'm curious to know what you think of the incorporation of qualitative methodologies in impact assessment as well, things like action research, community-based research, grounded theory, and like types of decolonial forms as well. So if you have any insight, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, methodology is definitely an aspect of designing a qualitative study that should be included when working with qualitative methods. And it's something I guess I didn't mention in some of the work I did, is that practitioners who are using qualitative methods are also often talking about or are demonstrating their work, and that includes then that locating themselves in their study, which is really necessary for social sciences to understand, you know, where the worldview of the researcher and how that's informing the data that they're coming up with and how they're interpreting it. And that's where, like you mentioned, community-based approaches and collaboration, and if you're working with First Nations and Indigenous people, having them co-lead. A lot of them built their own study boards, kind of advisory committees to lead the study. And so researchers, in a way, still inform it and help train. They might train community liaisons and stuff, but it's about having, kind of being a vessel, I think, as well. And I guess one distinction about our research was that it wasn't Indigenous-led, Indigenous impact assessment or methods in the Western science view of methods. It was Western science, social science methods. And so, yeah, when you're talking about epistemology and methodology and where you're coming from, that's, yeah, really one aspect that comes full circle from designing your work to interpreting it. So yeah, it's really important. I don't know if that answered your question, but you nailed it.
I think that's also a theory that we've seen in practice too with the past, well, today and yesterday with our presentations and comments and responses with more collaborative groups and research. Any other questions for our panel?
An online submitted question.
Excellent.
Anonymous asks, are there any pushbacks on responding to an HIA when you're not a medical professional? Are there any pushbacks on responding to an HIA when you're not a medical professional? Could you hear that okay?
I heard it, but I'm not sure if I understood it. Are there any pushbacks to an HIA?
On responding, are there any pushbacks on responding to a health impact assessment when you're not a medical professional?
Oh, no, of course. So, all right, so let me sort of answer that by talking about what an HIA is. And Elaine sort of like did an excellent job presenting to all of you today. It's an HIA is a tool. It's a framework by which you can look at the impacts of like any project, policy, and program on human health and what the distribution of those impacts are. So yes, we do look at peer-reviewed scientific literature within HIAs, but HIAs primarily approach projects, policies, and programs through a social determinants of health lens, right? And the social determinants of health, like, you know, using that definition from the World Health Organization, are the conditions in which we are born, grow, live, work, age, and these are influenced by levels of power at the municipal, federal, and global levels. So that's basically what an HIA is. And even though we do include a lot of sort of medical related information to try and identify why we're even looking at air quality or water quality and how that impacts health, primarily what we're using HIAs for is as a vehicle to listen to and address community concerns while applying that health, the social, economic factorization behind that, and how that plays out when, you know, projects are happening, when different phases of the project happens, and how they might impact communities. So really importantly for HIs, more than any other studies that are conducted as part of impact assessments, it is really needed that stakeholders and rights holders respond to how an HIA is being scoped, how an HIA is being planned, what information is being used within the HIA. Providing and sharing information with the project team with concerns that they have. Because if people don't express their health concerns, how is anyone to know, other than whatever is like written down and provided in statistics, what those health concerns may be? And as we all know, statistics don't capture everything. So people providing their on-the-ground feedback and grounding the assessment in reality is really important. That was a really long answer, but I hope it answers the question.
I think it did. And also combines the concept that we talked about with the overall theme of the panel with qualitative and quantitative, different approaches and the combination of them. Any other questions from our audience online, in person? Any questions from our, oh, yep, we've got one over here. Dorothy's on her way.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you for your great presentations. I have a question about the federal lands presentation. And I mean, it seems what you've outlined is potentially a gap or a potential for perhaps a duplication in process, I don't know, conflict between perhaps multiple jurisdictions in terms of their environmental or impact assessment processes. What is the remedy, I guess, that you could recommend based on your thinking and the research that you've done in this area?
Yeah. So I'm relatively new at this. I wrote this paper. I proposed the topic so that I could learn about it in order to present it, if you know what I mean. So famously academic. So I have learned a lot from NRCan and other folks about this. But so just to clarify, projects on federal lands, in a way, are meant to avoid jurisdictional overlap, right? That is just, and you know this better than I do, but they are intended, and this is why they were non-controversial in the SCC, or the Supreme Court of Canada's determination. Because as the leading judge said, the federal government can do what it likes on its own lands. The problem is when the Impact Assessment Agency is doing impact assessments on lands that are provincial. So to some extent, it's not a problem of that. It's only potentially an issue when there are multiple authorities who have to decide which one of them is the lead authority relative to a determination on a project on federal lands. So I'm somewhat deflecting your question because I don't think that's where the problem lies. But I do think, and this is where your colleague's presentation on NRCan's cumulative effects thing yesterday was so instructive and thought-provoking. I do know that communication between authorities at the federal level can sometimes be a challenge. You're all supposed to laugh, right? Because it's a huge challenge, right? It can, and especially when the mechanisms for how they are to collaborate on a complex information gathering and sharing and interpreting exercise, such as impact assessment, when that's not so clear. For big projects, we're getting a lot better at DFO collaborating with ECCC, with NRCan, when it comes to a complex impact assessment for a major offshore oil thing or something like that. And there are very tried and tested and well established ways in which federal authorities can provide the legislatively mandated expert advice to, right? But for POFLs, it's a lot less clear. Ultimately, in answer to your question, what would be your recommendation? My own view is that a more fulsome deposition of thought processes and documentation on the registry would be a great place to start. I don't mean that NRCan needs the registry in order to figure out what's going on in its own shop or in its relations. You have your own relations to ECCC, probably, right? But somehow the culture of documenting and being transparent that the registry is encouraging in the field of impact assessment I think it's a really good place to start. It's more paperwork, sure it is. Is it overkill for dredging a harbor that we've done 1,000 times and it's not sure? Yes, obviously I think that's the challenge to know when, right? But right now what we have is big projects and then the vast array of activities that fly completely unnoted, and then POFLs. And I think somehow there's at least maybe a spectrum of the more tougher POFLs that need a bit more guidance from the agency to help the interdepartmental collaboration. That would be my thought. Partly in the interest of cumulative effects assessment, right? So that NRCan's not doing it alone, for example, or that there's more rich data that can be shared across departments. But there are probably experts in the room that know a lot about data sharing initiatives within, as you do, relative across the government. So the Open Science Forum, I mean, that's something, but it's very much sustained and encouraged by, real attention and effort and time spent on having a rich registry, which I think is one of the biggest positives coming out of the 2019 Act, is the registry. But other thoughts? I don't know. Other people think.
All right. Given the time, we're going to move towards our closing remarks. So, one last round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, as well, for your questions. Moving into closing remarks, Violetta.
So I just want to thank all the moderators and all the presentations over the last 2 days. We've seen some really insightful presentations and a lot of great discussion. But at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Beth Williston, President and Conference Chair, who's going to provide our closing remarks. But while she's standing and before she comes up, I just wanted to, on behalf of the Planning Committee, say a big thank you for your leadership, your dedication, and your hard work in delivering such a successful conference this year.
Okay, that's embarrassing, but thank you. And my eyes are tired, so the glasses are coming on. They don't usually. The theme of this conference, Next Generation of Impact and Environmental Assessment, that's what it was. But our Indigenous, I said partners, they brought to it another lens of what are we planning for? What's the next generation? Well, in their perspective, it's 7 generations. So I am going to provide you with my 7 takeaways from this conference. The first, we have to connect with the community. We have to create meaningful spaces. We have to know who we are talking to. We have to do our research. Cumulative effects. Now, I've been in this industry a long time, and that's been a standard for 30 years. That's my time. I suspect it's longer than that. It's inclusive. We have to include in cumulative effects not just the environment, my personal one, but we have to have the cumulative effects on the Indigenous communities, on the GBA+, health, social, economic. We need to integrate oral histories and visual observations into our Western science. We have to acknowledge that these observations and stories over the course of the last few hundred years, where Western science is only about, 50 years or so, we have to start broadening this, and we have to start looking at the effects over a very, very long period of time. And this ties back to IA and EA, and that it's all about adding up. I will quote our last speaker. It's about being faithful in the small things. Transparency is key. So 7 generations of connections. We need to think past our Western 20 years or so of the planning horizon, 50 years if we're, really being advanced, and we have to really start thinking about our 7 generation time frame. Procurement, that was a good topic, good discussion yesterday. So I'm going to use this as a comparison and a bit of food for thought. So you all know I work at TRCA, and we're a regulator. So you come to us at a pre-EA stage, you come to us at pre-permit stage, you get our data, you learn about our requirements. We have developed strong relationships with the federal government, with the province, with the municipalities, with the consultancy, and with the community. You include us in your procurement. You pay our fees, and you compensate for environmental losses as part of your mitigation strategies. So while Indigenous nations aren't regulators, they have rights. Is there any difference between a regulation and a right? Think about it. It's an interesting concept, and maybe, just maybe, it could change the engagement and procurement process in the future. A good project, this is number 5, a good project should be able to complete the full process is age-old. But maybe as the industry practitioners, if the agency practitioners can figure it out, it's how do we manage the politics of decision-making? I suspect the answer may lie with how we work with our Indigenous partners in the context of IEA and EA. And along the same lines, a good project must also follow good and clear EA processes and practices. We must continually modernize the IA and EA process to achieve this. Science and technology. Not only do we need continued advancement, we need better and more complex data management, and we need to ensure our Western science incorporates Indigenous knowledge and recognizes them as equal. And equal. And let's not forget climate change. So many political changes, so let's keep going. And finally, we have to get her done. I think this could help with our political decision-making situation. When the process is too cumbersome, it's hard. So thanks MECP for modernizing. Thanks IAC for trying to modernize. When we do collect the right information or engage with the correct regulators, then we do have a good process. When we don't collect the right information or engage in the right regulations, then we have problems. When we don't take the time to develop relationships with our community and political and agency partners, we need to do that. We need to develop trust, and it's with all partners, not just a few that we always go to. It's with everybody. That trust is essential. When we get nothing done quickly, the politicians will step in. We may not like their decisions, but they will step in. I'm going to leave you with a final example of a story. It's been brought up a few times over the past couple of days. It's the Ontario Line subway. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Ontario Line subway first appeared in the planning documents in 1910. Yeah, 1910. We are starting construction now. So that's 113 years. That is 7 generations. So just imagine if we had built that 7 generations ago. In the end, the politicians did step in to get it done. And as we saw today, the planning process is complete. Oh, yeah, they stepped in and got it done. But we've seen, as we saw today, we saw in Lisa's project, once we get that planning process, that was only 1 generation, that was 20 years. But once we got that done, the construction can move really, really quickly. So if we want to remove our politicians from this decision-making process and we want to get things done, I think that we don't want their fast-tracked planning process, then perhaps we need to ensure that we do better behind the scenes. We need to modernize, we need to get the right data, and we need to have trusting relationships. This is what I see as the next generation of IA and EA in Ontario. Yes, you can clap. Okay. Okay, next slide. Where's my next slide? Yeah, okay. So, I would also like to acknowledge again our planning members. They can stand if they'd like to, but I made them do that last night, and I might not want to. But without the planning committee, they gave me a lot of accolades. I have to give those accolades right back. We are definitely a team. I've run a lot of things in my, lifetime, started quite young and running different events and et cetera. And my own personal standard of if something is going well, I do nothing on the day of the event. I have done almost nothing yesterday and today, and that's because of them. So they've done everything. But thank you guys, you did so great. Okay. I want to reiterate the thank you to all of our presenters and to our moderators. They made the 2 days go very well. I want to again thank Webcast Guru for doing our whole virtual and online program. It's Andrew, Alex, Forrest, and Rob. They are fantastic to work with if anybody's looking. I also want to thank Greg and his team from Blue Moth. They have done the program, they manage our website, they manage the registration, they manage all of the materials and the printing that you've seen today and yesterday, so thank you to them as well. This one was part of this morning when the slides didn't work so well, so I do want to reiterate our call for board members. We are definitely looking for new members. It's a 2-year term. We're going to extend the deadline from November 3rd to November 10th, just to give everybody a little more time to think about it, or if you've thought about it, just to get your paperwork in. That'll be posted. There's an e-blast that's almost ready to come. It'll be out probably tomorrow. The voting for that is at our AGM. So one of the I guess the great things about being able to operate in a virtual environment is we can have our AGM a little bit later in the year, and it breaks up the conference from the AGM, which has been of great benefit to us. So we're going to host it again in December, and the term will start in January. We would like you to all come and participate. It starts just after work, hopefully, before dinner. Try to do that. So please save the date, and another e-blast will come on that as well. So before I say goodbye, a couple of quick housekeeping. You know that there's a QR code on your postcard for the survey. We have 2 meetings planned in the next 4 weeks, 3 weeks, and we're going to be looking at those results, and they matter. That's what we use to inform and plan next year's conference. So please, please, please take a second and do that. It's pretty short. And the other one is please leave your name tags. Please leave them in the box at the registration. So to those participating in our virtual forum, thank you. Maybe next year we'll see you in person, but I'm really happy that you were able to come and join us these past 2 days. And to those here, thank you as well, and safe travels.